Stay up to date on the latest political news this election season for less. Visit inforum.news/port and get 3 months of unlimited access to our news network for only 99 cents a month. Subscribe now at inforum.news/port. This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Forum Communications Company is proud to be a part of the Trust Project. Learn more at thetrustproject.org. Welcome to Plain Talk, and so I don't think I probably need to tell any of you this, but the nature of our debate over the issue of abortion has changed. It's not the same debate it was in the past. In the past, it was a legal argument, and it's not anymore. It's now a matter of public policy to be debated in our democratic institutions, our legislatures, at our ballot boxes. And that's a good thing. I wrote a column in the wake of it, and it's funny because the ACLU actually kind of pitched this interview to me on the basis of my column. My column was, I think it was kind of, I was arguing that more protests won't make abortion legal in North Dakota. And I think I probably could have been clearer because obviously protests are hugely important to the democratic process. My argument was protesting outside of the Supreme Court is not going to accomplish very much at this point. I understand people are mad, they're venting. I don't begrudge them that. Whatever I may feel about their positions, that's that. And Cody, you wrote a blog post, though, about how important protest is, and I have a feeling we're going to talk about it. I have a feeling we're going to spend a lot of time probably agreeing, at least on that concept.
Well, yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Rob. I think what happened was after your article, I mean, I think there were moments in which especially among our team, we had that typical debriefing conversation, right? We were reading it. You mentioned us and quoted me briefly in it, and as we were going through, we were like, oh, well, Rob makes some good points, but also Rob's wrong, right? Like that was kind of our conversation, right? In staff meeting, and so we decided that we'd want to just kind of put out there, because of our the stress and the importance on the First Amendment and how important it is, but also the logistics around it. And
Sure.
You're right. You and I probably have a number of places where we would agree on it. But I thought it was.
Well, let's talk about the places where Rob Port's supposedly wrong.
Oh yeah. Well, I think it was really. I mean, it was more so. I think coming down to. Sort of, and like you just said, you might have, maybe there's lost in translation or for brevity, right? I know I'm a writer as well, and you sort of sometimes finesse points, and then people think that you said something different. But I think really around the, sort of that, just if I may boil it down to like, do protests do anything, right? And I think that for us, obviously, everybody has the right to express themselves. But from a logistical standpoint, protesting is a great way to raise issues, and I think maybe one of the things we could talk about is because I know you commented about, raising awareness. But I think that when we do things like a protest, it can change the conversation in different places because like an issue like abortion, it doesn't always get talked about at the kitchen table. It's been, it's off and on as a taboo issue, or at least how deep we go into talking about it. And I think that the more we raise the issue, there might be those who might start to talk about it who wouldn't have otherwise.
Actually, the funny thing is we really agree on this. I understand that you're coming from this. Your organization has long argued that there's a right to abortion in the U.S. Constitution. The Supreme Court just struck that down, but that's, I'm assuming, is still your organization's position, despite the ruling of the court.
Yes, and I would say that what's happening right now for us is obviously looking at how to get that right back, right, and that's going to take a lot of different tactics in different states, etc.
So let me build on that. One of the problems I had with reading into the U.S. Constitution a right to abortion that I don't think exists, separate from whether or not it should exist, My argument was it didn't exist. There was never an amendment added to that Constitution that was explicitly intended to create a right to an abortion. I always had a problem with that. And one of the reasons why is I think one of the you just described, in that it took the abortion issue away from us. We didn't discuss it at our tables. We could sort of sweep it under the rug and say, well, that's just too, I don't want to deal with it. Or the people who did talk about it, I think, left and right, could adopt some pretty extreme positions on it that maybe weren't even reflective of where most Americans are on the question, because it wasn't part of the democratic process. The courts reached down, grabbed it, put it in the Constitution, and said basically, you can't do anything with this through the democratic process. I think that was a shame. I think it did a terrible, terrible disservice to Americans on this issue. I think we would be in a much healthier place, right? I mean, the abortion, without question, one of the most contentious political issues that have faced our country in modern history. I think we'd be in a much healthier place had we solved this question democratically instead of through the courts. I think that really matters. One of the geniuses of the American system of government, and really any sort of democracy, is that it allows buy-in, right? Like, I feel like if I go and, like a ballot measure, for instance, right? You're for it, I'm against it, we have the debate, one of us loses. Maybe I don't like losing, but I can at least say, well, you know, I made my case, and I guess maybe I'll try again in some other way. I think that's so important, and I think we just did a terrible disservice to ourselves on this question by moving it outside of the democratic process. That's been a point that I've been trying, and it gets lost in how, because everybody sees it through the lens of how they want, what they want abortion policy to be. And to me, like, I'm over here making the process argument, which nobody wants to hear, right? So, but I do. I think it's important, and I think it should be central to this debate.
Well, and I appreciate the process argument, actually, because I do think process and backstory, et cetera, are all really, really important. And I think that does create conversation around the kitchen table in a different way when it is a policy matter. And of course, now we're about to see that and are seeing it. But, you know, so first of all, you know, I wasn't alive when Roe v. Wade happened, so I don't know what the conversations were at the time. I've heard various things, but I think where, for me, part of the disservice is in that regardless of reading of the Constitution, right? So whether there's that right to privacy that would protect abortion. We have been having a conversation about it for the last 50 years. And as someone who, grew up in some of those conversations in the church that I grew up in as a kid, and various conversations that happened in school, et cetera, when we would talk about this in a learning setting, for me, there was so much shame around the conversation. So it was always about the focus has been on the moral question, right, rather than the constitutionality or the policy side of it. And so I think that I guess I am sort of, I am glad, I agree with you that maybe that conversation would maybe change things. However, again, you and I, we shouldn't probably debate the constitutional interpretation because we know where we stand on that one. But I think that having the process conversation is really interesting. So I appreciate you pointing in that direction.
Well, it's because here's one thing. You look at that period between when Roe v. Wade was handed down and when Dobbs was handed down. Mm-hmm. We had legislatures across the country continue to legislate. But they were legislating in a very weird way, which is all these trigger laws that are now, including in North Dakota. So let's look at North Dakota specifically. We have a trigger law that is probably going to take effect. I know there's still litigation, but it's probably going to take effect here at some point.
Yeah.
That was passed by Democratic lawmakers. Democratic lawmakers introduced it. Several Democratic lawmakers, including some very progressive lawmakers who are still in office today, voted for it. And one of the reasons behind the scenes, now I haven't spoken to any of them directly, and so I don't want to, but one of the things that progressive people have kind of told me behind the scenes is, well, they voted for it because they never thought it was going to take effect. And I think that is probably the reality for a lot of these laws, not just for Democrats, but for Republicans, right? Because it became very easy to sort of talk about abortion. We're going to ban all abortions except for instances of rape or incest or health of the mother. We're going to do all these things. And nobody really had to think about, as a practical matter of a policy, how do we enforce a rape exception to an abortion? I don't know the good answer to that, because I know how the criminal justice system works. Do we have to convict somebody in court of rape before we can have the exception for abortion? That's not going to happen within the window of a pregnancy. So obviously, like, we have made some policies that we never really intended to become law, because we thought Roe was just going to be there forever. And now suddenly we have to, right and left, we have to really think about the policy we're making. I think that's as much of a headache as it's going to be, a real pain in the rear end. I think that's a good thing. We have to think about this stuff. It's really going to impact people now. We have to think about this stuff. Yeah,
I mean, I think I would agree from a policy, from the sausage making argument, right? I think that it probably is, it is good. I think that, you know, it's unfortunate that because of the culture wars, the policy making process in the past, the debate and the argument around, so like you said, progressive voting for it because they thought it would never take effect. The same thing with maybe those in the middle, or even some on the right who, you know, that isn't their issue that they hang their hat on. I think that it is unfortunate that took place, because now it really takes, like you said, I mean, it's from my perspective, it's going to hurt people because of this. It's going to make things challenging for people in being able to exercise, you know, having a right taken away from our perspective. But I would say that I think it actually points to a bigger issue of the polarization and the changing politics from 2007 till today. And so, I mean, I would be even interested, Rob, on your thoughts on that with the polarization. You know, yes, I see your point that had the Supreme Court not made that decision, you know, 50 years ago, maybe we would have been having the conversation differently. But what about sort of that? You know, I would raise questions around the context of the argument at the moment, right? You know, why these individuals would, you know, what was the politics that would say to a progressive to say, like, well, I'm going to vote for it too, and then fill in the blank. Why did they do that? Well, like you said, you haven't talked to anybody, neither have I. So,
well,
you know,
I suspect part of the. I mean, you look at some of the lawmakers. I mean, they were from Western North Dakota rural districts, and they may have been personally pro-choice, but just didn't want to pick a fight. And if you're voting for a law that's not going to take effect anyway, or so you thought, I think the calculation is there. Why pick a fight? Why pick a fight on a contentious issue that I don't have to pick a fight on? Because this vote ultimately doesn't matter. And I mean, the thing is it's a policy that they make should matter, and there should be consequences for it, right? And there was no consequence for abortion policy. Well, now there is. I mean, now if you're a state that has passed a total ban on abortion with no exceptions, as a lawmaker, you now have to sit and look in the eyes of the parents of a 10-year-old girl who can't get an abortion despite having been raped, because by definition, no 10-year-old can lawfully engage in that sort of stuff. So, I mean, you're if you voted for that policy, now you got to look some people in the eye, because it's really going to take effect.
Well, and I wouldn't take away, you know, that some individuals might vote, you know, might have also voted based on their moral standing, right?
Sure.
Where they're, you know,
there's pro-life there's a pro-life Democrat running for the U.S. Congress in North Dakota this cycle.
Exactly. And so, and I mean, and I would say, you know, many years ago, I lived in South Dakota, and some of the work that I did with some college students in lobbying against the juvenile death penalty. And that was a very narrow vote, but the legislature passed it, and Senator Mike Rounds was governor at the time, and he was under a lot of pressure to not sign that bill, to you know, going against the death penalty. But he was, at the time, I remember him as a practicing Catholic, you know, voting, you know, informed by his faith in that regard. And so I would never, I mean, I have. While I may disagree with some of the lawmakers that have voted in that way, that has gone against their party or other pieces of the platform, I do have that respect for how their their faith or other aspects of morality or life experience might change their vote. And I would say that on both sides. If there's a Republican who says, I had this experience in my life, or I believe this thing, and I'm going to go against my party for that, I have a lot of respect for that. And so I would not rule that out in that process or in that part of the sausage making that took place over the years.
What's really interesting is that if we look at the public polling on this issue, if Roe hadn't been handed down, I think we would probably be at a place where in most states in the union, abortion is legal, with a restriction after a certain number of weeks, because that's where public opinion is. Most Americans want abortion to be legal, but they also think that the timing of the abortion matters, and they think it should be illegal, most of them, after some time period, usually 15 to 20. I mean, there's some variance there. I don't know. I think that's where our democracy, our democratic process in the various states would have settled. And to me, that looks like a very good compromise. You still have legal access, but it's a moderated and regulated access. And that to me is that's the middle position between it should always be illegal and it should always be legal. Those are the two extremes that have been guiding this debate. Most Americans are in the middle. That's where we would have been. If Roe had never been decided, I feel like that's where we would have been as a country. And we wouldn't even really be talking about this. I feel like it would have been settled by now.
No, I respectfully disagree, because I think there are lots of other places where law has intervened, and or where either be ruling or making of a law, and the way that the debate happens continue publicly. I mean, I think about, and this is, I'm making an apples to oranges argument, but when I think a little bit about, like, for instance, the Voting Rights Act, right, and the Supreme Court, that has clearly there are issues with voting across the country, and the Supreme Court saying, we don't need it anymore, has proven to necessarily not be accurate in the way. I mean, racism is still alive, right here in our own state. We saw, and I'm making because it's not a decided issue, but I mean that there were those who walked away from the polls in Fargo during the primary and said, we feel because of our race, we were not treated the same as white voters. And whether that led to voter suppression or not is a different question, a different conversation for a different day. But I think that, I don't know if Roe would never have happened, if the conversation would have just, gone progressive, as we've seen the argument. So because I think that there's other places, like I said, like with voting.
I don't even know that you could say progressive. I mean, what is a ban on abortion after 15 weeks? I mean, is that a pro-life position or a pro-choice position? I feel like Planned Parenthood might have a different answer to that question than I do.
Right.
So I don't know. And you're,
that's accurate. Yeah.
I guess the voting issue. I mean, the problem with the voting issue is it's so central to how the politicians get their jobs, right? I mean, that's almost, that issue belongs almost in its own galaxy of politics.
Yeah. Which is why I said it's apples to oranges.
Right. Right.
Correct.
That's
but the fact that that the Supreme Court made a decision, and we are still seeing that there are potential issues. I don't think it would have.
Sure.
Things wouldn't have just worked out because we had or didn't have it. If we would never have had the Voting Rights Act, would there have been certain progress or protections that would have, would lawmakers have quote unquote done the right thing and protected the right to vote in places where racism
right.
was the problem.
And I think, democracy is not a panacea. In fact, democracy often becomes a tool by which, people who are bigots or have untoward motivations, they use it, right? They try to get their voters out. They try to, get their message across the same as everybody else. So democracy is always going to be rowdy. It's just that I would rather have that. Because if you look on a long enough timeline, we make progress, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, being openly racist is not okay in 2022 America. Right. George Wallace once ran for president, and that was like a part of his platform. So, that's progress, right? And I understand if somebody who's experiencing it personally and viscerally, that's cold comfort, and I get that. I'm not trying to say the problem has disappeared. I'm trying to say we are getting better, And we do get better, and we have to trust the democratic process to express that as policy. I would rather do that than trust in courts. And I realize that I'm saying this to the ACLU, which is in the business of getting the courts to maybe do these things. But I would rather.
Actually, Rob, I think that's something important to note is that, when the ACLU was founded, the ACLU is known for, we'll see you in court. Like that's how people frame it. It's the phone calls that I get all the time of people asking me, legal questions. I work for the advocacy department. I'm not an attorney, but it is interesting that is that overwhelming perception. But the longer history of the ACLU from the founding really was to be much more like a union. I mean, that's why that's in the name, and to be able to influence policy. I mean, the largest. The first budgets of the ACLU, when it took on that moniker, that largest budget was policy and influence. I think we've talked about it. I think that the actual budget line item in those first ones was propaganda. Was actually the word that was used at the time. And so even though that's what we're known for, there is a very wide swath of the work that we do that is about trying to do the policy development, right? It's not just about suing your way to victory. It's about how do we write better laws? How do we influence public opinion? How do we, obviously we're nonpartisan. We're not trying to work on candidate issues, but trying to work in the realm of exactly what we're talking about. And so on one hand, yes, I think you and I, and we find some common ground on, yes, the policy part is really important, but I think at the same time, our interpretation as an organization of the Constitution is that's where you and I would differ.
Yeah.
I would say personally and professionally.
What I struggle with is that the law should be intentional. Right, like if we're gonna say that there's a right to something, then at some point there should have been a democratic process that ended with an intentional, and we intended to create that, not some black-robed law professor found it in the penumbras. I don't buy that. I don't like that. I think that's abhorrent to a democratic society. Whatever the policy issue, I don't want them to find rights to things that I like either. I would rather fight for those in the legislative process, and that's why, I'm tired of people protesting outside of the Supreme Court. Right? I think the court got this one right. Protest outside of Congress. Protest outside of your legislatures, because to me the message from the Supreme Court on Dobbs, on West Virginia versus EPA, and some others was, hey, legislators, legislate. Right? If you want these things to be law, then write some laws. But stop and that frustrates me, because the courts have become, in my opinion, so overbearing. I think it's allowed legislatures to just sort of punt issues. We're going to write very vague laws, and then we're going to wait for the courts to interpret their way to the right outcome. That's baloney. And that, to me, that's got to stop.
Yeah. Well, and I think that I would say that, there's a gray area between where we're at this point, where I'd say, I think that there also has been, because of Roe, right, there has been the opportunity for legislators to use the legislative process to challenge the legal process. And so, we've seen all of our energy and our focus into let's write and design laws to get that court case, to try and get that victory, which is now what has happened.
Right, the right was doing that. I mean, that's what the Dobbs case was a Mississippi law that was explicitly written to get the courts to overturn Roe.
Right, and so and so I think that that also has shaped the legislative process to be about something that it wasn't helpful, but again, we're coming from two different angles, which is
my opinion. They were trying to get a bad precedent in Roe, in Casey, bad precedents overturned, and restore it. I mean, I like what Justice Kavanaugh wrote in his concurrence, which was the Constitution is neutral on abortion. Now, it doesn't have to be. You could amend the U.S. Constitution to put in an amendment regarding abortion if you wanted to, and you could build the appropriate level of democratic support. Or you could just create a federal statute because the Ninth Amendment allows for that sort of thing. But anyway, that's I think it's such an interesting issue. I said the Ninth Amendment, you got all excited.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say though, I want to go back to, because the whole reason we were going to have this conversation was around the idea of like, well, the worthiness of protesting. And I love what you said, protesting in front of the Supreme Court versus Congress, right? Yes, protesting may not, protesting on the steps of the Supreme Court isn't going to get the Supreme Court to do something different. That's, they're interpreting laws. They're not making them in that way. And at the same time, the power of protest to be able to express how you're feeling. I mean, I don't think it matters the steps of which place that you would protest on. You're raising the issue, and so for me, it's the location of it isn't real important. It's about I mean, we protested here in Fargo, rallied and on the steps of the Fargo City Hall, which is, they have no, very little
right.
to do in this, So I think for me, I think that going back to sort of the idea of the value of protest, I would be curious for you, because we started this by saying we probably agree on a bunch of those things. I was curious if you would expand a little bit about what you had written in your column about the value of protesting.
Yeah, well, because I do think it's valuable, and I do think it's a valuable expression of public sentiment. But to me, it has to be. It's not going to accomplish anything if it's indiscriminate, and then also if it's alienating, which I think are two real problems. One is that we're not protesting the right people. Right, your focus, now that the Supreme Court's ruled, your focus has got to be on the people who make the policy. So that's either ballot measures, or in North Dakota, that's either ballot measures or the legislature. And get involved there. That's the appropriate place. And then in terms of being alien, and the right and the left do this, it's always my team versus your team. Political movements win through addition, not subtraction. And so at some of these protests, I read some of the lines, some of the signs, and as a conservative, who by the way is open to the idea of compromise on abortion, right? I'm not a ban it all the time, everywhere, pro-life conservative, but it's hard for me to make common cause with people who, by reading their signs, don't like people like me and don't seem interested in having us part of the coalition. I mean, I think that's another thing that we lose when the courts grab these issues out of the democratic process, is it robs us of that necessity for coalition building. If you want to make policy, first of all, you're going to have to accept the fact that you're not going to get everything you want because you got to compromise. And second of all, you're going to have to make common cause sometimes with people you don't like very much. And that's, it's got to be inviting.
Yeah, I agree that coalition building needs to be broader than that. I would say that just even the response to Roe, there has been some ground level coalition building, in the sense that I think a lot of people, I personally spoke to folks at, on the day of the decision, there was an impromptu rally that took place that, we were not a part of sponsoring, but I personally went as a citizen. And then there was the two events that we had sponsored, and we are with partners, and there was interest. It was very interesting for me to talk to folks because we were getting, while we might not have been promoting a ballot measure, I mean, I think we're too early in what's the response, as it was coming down in real time. And obviously we're also far enough away from when we could get something on a ballot, or before the legislative session that's coming up. So it was a little too early right away here as the decision came. But coalition building was happening, maybe only on sort of one side of the aisle, right? But there were definitely individuals that I knew, Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, that were all there finding camaraderie in a moment when they were upset. So, I talked to some folks that were, quote unquote, more conservative, who had shown up and said, this isn't something that I've ever done before, but I feel really strongly about this thing. I mean, I have family members. I have family members who are very conservative, but the one issue that was always their issue is, don't tell me what to do with my body. And so,
I think that also,
and those family members would never
go
to a protest like this, but they might now, and find other common ground for the future movement.
But I also think that gets back to the policy that we have on the books is going to be enforced now. And I think a lot of the total bans are probably go a lot further than where the average, even somebody who thinks of themselves as being conservative Republican, goes a lot further than where they're willing to go. And also, if they're going to be enforced, have some practical implications that maybe we hadn't considered back when we passed them because we never thought that they would be enforced. I mean, there's real opportunity to build there. And in a place like North Dakota, you're just not going to win anything politically without getting some Republicans on board. You're just, it's the way our state's constituted.
And I think the rally in front of City Hall was step one. I think it brought together folks that were of a variety of stripes, because there were, there were signs that even, might have made me personally uncomfortable for, even though we agree.
Right. I'm not trying to, you could show up to any protest for anything and find some nuts, right? I mean, that's,
but I think step one of the coalition building, step one of policy change took place on a hot day in July where about 1,000 people showed up. And I noticed a lot of age diversity there. There was racial diversity there. I think there was some political diversity there as I talked to a few folks, and they all came together to talk. The new friendships were made, new relationships were made for the larger movement in the future. So I don't think it's exclusive. I think, Rob, what you're saying about the policy part, I think that's step two. Step one was those folks rallying around it, getting out their feelings, connecting with other people that they may not have known before. It also gave an opportunity for those who disagree. There were counter protesters that were there, and a number of folks that were there holding prayer vigil on the edge of the time. And for the most part, that was a very respectful. There was a couple folks, I think, that were maybe having some verbal altercations.
Like I said,
it was very peaceful.
No side's got a monopoly on nuts.
So it was, but I think like I said, I think it was step one, and I think that what happened there, the impromptu rally and the two other rallies that happened here in Fargo. I can't speak to the other communities because I wasn't present where that happened, but I think what happened is citizens of the Fargo-Moorhead area came together and started to lay the groundwork of whatever is future, because signatures were collected. People who wanted to give their name to us or to Planned Parenthood or other organizations, they did that, and those are folks that we can follow up with to say, what do we want to do that's next?
That's honestly what I'm excited about. I feel like on a long enough timeline, North Dakota's probably going to have a more moderate policy on abortion than that trigger law. I think it's going to take some time to get there. I think it's going to take some time. We've been in trench warfare on this issue for a long time, and I think it's going to take a while for some people to climb up out of those trenches and try to find a new path. And honestly, I'm excited about that, and I think that is a great gift. And again, you probably hear this as heresy, but I think it's a great gift that the Supreme Court gave us, and also whether you like it or not, they gave it to us. So here we are, and I would rather have this. I would rather have a meaningful debate to develop policy that will actually be applied than to have, again, law professors in robes settling the issue for us. That's all the time I have for you, though, Cody. I really appreciate it. You coming on.
Yeah, I do. I just want to say I agree that you and I disagree on that foundational point, but I think I'm also
which is moot. Yeah,
I'm a silver lining guy, and so I also agree that I look for the positives in this, and so I think there is great opportunity here, and so on that we do agree.
Thank you for your time, Cody.
Hey, thanks. Glad to be here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chad Kuhl, host of the Northland Outdoors podcast. Hey, here in the Northland, we love our time outside. And on the Northland Outdoors podcast, we're going to talk about all of it. Not just fishing, not just hunting, but mountain biking, camping, rock climbing, bird watching, you name it. We're going to have it on the Northland Outdoors podcast. New episodes every 2 weeks on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. So look for it and join us on the Northland Outdoors podcast.
We'll just finish up an interview with Cody Schuler with the North Dakota ACLU. Well, they're not just the North Dakota. I think they're a regional thing. I think it's North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota. Anyway, he's always fun to talk to. We disagree on a lot, but we agree. And I think we're moving towards a brighter future where we're going to be settling important questions, even seemingly intractable political questions like abortion, settling them through the democratic process rather than in a courtroom, because as hard as it is, we have to settle policy questions there, not in court. But let's switch gears. Let's talk to somebody who works in court a great deal, Kim Hegvik. She is currently an assistant state's attorney with the Cass County State's Attorney's Office. She is campaigning to be the state's attorney for the Cass County, the Cass County State's Attorney. So we're gonna be talking to her right now. And Kim, first of all, tell us about your campaign. What prompted you to want to run for state's attorney?
Well, I have been in the office it'll be 16 years this fall. My boss, Birch Burdick, he is retiring after 24 years.
Is something of a political, his last name, Quentin Burdick. I mean, he's a legend. I don't know, is that too far? I mean, he's had a lot of notoriety.
Oh yeah, his family. It would be nearly impossible to run against him. The federal courthouse is named after his father. His father also, I think, Job Corps is named after him. Maybe even a building on NDSU now.
There's a big old street. There's a big old street through the center of Minot named after him.
Yeah, and I love the fact that his mom served in the United States legislature.
First female senator from North Dakota.
I think that's fantastic.
So what prompted you to want? Obviously, he made the decision to step down, so you're not running against him. Ryan Youngren, who is your colleague in the office, you're running against him. So again, I guess that was my question to you. What made you want to run?
Well, I have a vision for the office, and I would love an opportunity to make that vision a reality. I kind of came up in prosecuting through working in juvenile court and working in drug courts. So I have a philosophy that I've developed throughout the years, and certainly I've been able to indoctrinate portions of the office already, but I would love the opportunity to take that further.
There is a perception in Fargo specifically, because again, you'd be the Cass County State's Attorney if you won this election. There's a perception that crime is becoming more of a problem than it has been perhaps in years past. Can you speak to that?
Sure. One of the things that I have done routinely in our office, just because I think it's very interesting, is to run our numbers as far as the number of things that are being sent to our office to review, things that ultimately get charged out, what our numbers look like. And not surprisingly, from 2019 to 2020, numbers jumped. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody with what happened with COVID and the criminal justice system screeching to a halt, crime rates rising, mental health issues, substance use disorders. It was down in 2021 compared to 2020 for our office. And my prediction is that the crime rate in Cass County will actually dip again this year from last year. But I can certainly see why it's feeling like crime is rising. Drug crimes, I think in particular, are probably up, which would not be surprising. I think that follows a national trend for drug crimes rising. But overall, I think that we will see a slight decline from last year. The numbers in our office went from about 8,700. My prediction is will be, it was closer to 8,900. I'm thinking we're going to see about 8,600 roughly.
Those are like criminal files, criminal cases?
This is just the whole numbers for what comes into our office. So it's everything from the people who are referred to drug court, our appeals, our criminal cases, our personal crimes cases, because we handle a lot. Our office handles not only the criminal side of things, but we also handle some civil things as well, juvenile delinquency cases, mental health cases.
What do you think people would be surprised? I mean, I think obviously most people listening to this know what a prosecutor does. They know what the Cass County State's Attorney's Office does. What's a part of that job that you think the average public would be surprised to learn about, or maybe a common misconception about the job?
Well, we're not the Attorney General's office. I'm not quite sure why they chose to name us the state's attorneys, because we're essentially the county attorney or the district attorney. We're not the U.S. attorney, so my office is not at the federal courthouse. I think also people would be maybe surprised at the number of people who commit offenses that we never see again. For example, DUI offenders. About 80% don't reoffend after their first time. I think people might also be surprised to learn that my office is not an investigating agency. We don't employ any investigators, any law enforcement agencies. We are separate and apart from them. We work closely with them, obviously, but everything that we review comes over to us from, the vast majority come from Fargo Police Department, West Fargo Police Department, North Dakota Highway Patrol, NDSU, and then of course the Cass County Sheriff's Office.
Do your the incumbent is Birch Burdick, has been in office, like you mentioned, for about 2.5 decades. What would you do? I mean, that's a long time for someone to be in office, and without being critical at all of him. And what would you do differently? I mean, do you think there's things that need to be changed about how the office goes about its business?
Overall, I think Birch has run a very good office. I think that he has done his administrative duties, of course, but also given the prosecutors in our office the discretion that they need in order to do their jobs as well. I would like to see more of a trend toward looking at the research of what actually works for curbing the recidivism rates, the rates that people commit new crimes. I think there's a lot of data, a lot of research out there that we just haven't dug into to be able to apply it to our caseloads.
Give me an example.
Well, for example, somewhere along the line, we decided that to hold people accountable and to punish them, the immediate answer was incarceration. And there's actually a whole gamut of things that we can do to hold people accountable and keep them in the community. So, for example, those DUI offenders, 80% of them probably don't need to be incarcerated. A large percentage of them, if we were to do a chemical dependency evaluation, won't require any services. And in fact, if we were to put them into, say, inpatient treatment, for example, we could actually make them worse. And when we are incarcerating people, I think the magic number is like 48 hours, and then their risk of reoffending actually goes up. And when we're looking at reducing crime, I think that there are a lot of community-based services that, if they're delivered effectively, we could see, instead of that immediately feeling good about sending somebody to either the jail or the prison, we could see better returns with our dollars that we're spending if we could plug people into the right services, hold them accountable, certainly, but also be looking long term.
Your opponent is Ryan Youngren, who's also working in your office. I've always wondered, like, when two deputies run against each other for sheriff or two state's attorney, how does that work? You're working in the same office with the person that you're also running against for this office. We all know that political campaigns can get personal and ugly. Not to say that this one has, but they can be. I mean, it can be uncomfortable. Talk about that dynamic a little bit.
Oh, it's absolutely uncomfortable. I would be lying if I said that it wasn't. Ryan's office is 2 doors down from mine. We've worked together since he joined our office 15 years ago. We certainly have a few things that we don't see eye to eye on. But overall, I think both of us have intended to run a clean race, not get down and dirty. We both, I think, want people to vote for us because they think that we're the best candidate, not because they dislike the other person.
Talk about some of the differences between you said you disagree on some things, or talk about that, because to me that's the nuts and bolts of a campaign, right? Voters have a choice to make, this person or that person. What are the contrasts in your mind?
I think that trying jury trials, for example, that is a part of what we do, but that is a very, very small percentage of what we do. There are 16 prosecutors in our office who come to work every day, passionate about their jobs and fully equipped to try a case against someone. There's so much more to our work. Obviously, we have over 8,000 cases a year, and if every one of those went to trial, that would back up our system significantly. I had mentioned before that my kind of background coming into this has to do with the drug court program, for example, juvenile court. So I've really embraced, as I've gone on in my career, this idea that if you can get to the underlying causes, the root causes for people's behavior, you can affect change not only in the immediate, but down the road. So in juvenile court, for example, we look at holding people accountable, but also utilizing least restrictive means. Juvenile court does a really good job at running the kids through risk assessments, risk needs assessments. So you can determine not only what's driving their behavior, but what programming you might be able to utilize to change that behavior. I think that a lot of that can carry over to drug court, and drug court also really focuses on research and what changes people's behavior, not just what feels good in the immediate, but what can actually change their behavior down the road. When you're looking at incarcerating somebody in the county jail, I think it's $110 a day or something like that, over $40,000 a year. The penitentiary, over $50,000 a year to house somebody. Drug courts, the average is every dollar that a community spends on drug court programming is about a $27 savings. And
I think all that's very interesting. I think North Dakota is like a lot of places. I think we've been making ground on criminal justice reform. That's a term with a lot of different meanings. It's a big umbrella, a lot of policies underneath it. I sense that there's some backlash against it, right? Because that progress has been happening for a long time. It's been happening in our prisons, where we've made reforms about how we do that. It's been happening in the courts, where we've made reforms. It's even been happening in the news media, right? We've been having a debate about how we use mugshots, for instance, which I've written a lot about, which I think is a very interesting debate. I'm beginning to sense some backlash, and we see it really in other parts of the country, but like in San Francisco, where, you know, people who came in who were perceived as being very pro-criminal justice reform, but then those communities had rampant problems with crime and homelessness, and people wanted kind of a backtrack to law and order. So obviously North Dakota's not San Francisco. We're not Seattle. We're not New York City. You know, we're Cass County certainly isn't those things. It's Fargo and the other communities. But I do perceive that there could be a backlash against some of that, particularly after what we just went through with the pandemic. There's a perception that crime's getting out of control. We're having lots of protests. Like, I think a lot of Americans, rightly or wrongly, are perceiving things as kind of spiraling a bit. And that may, I think, engender some pushback on the sort of things you're talking about. Speak to that a little bit. Like, how do you continue to make the case for criminal justice reform in this environment?
What I think is really interesting is if you look at the national trends, the red states, the red cities are experiencing the same crime rates, the same safety concerns that the communities that have enacted more of the criminal justice reform have. And in fact, I think that there are some areas where they have enacted less criminal justice reform and they've seen an increase in crime. I think we need to be very careful about wanting to feel safer versus actually being safer, if that makes sense. So if you have, for example, we had 3 shootings in a weekend, that doesn't translate to 3 times as many shootings.
Yeah.
And I think that goes back to my interest in actually looking at the research, actually looking at the numbers, rather than just going off of
public perception. I can remember years ago, the local media. I live up here in Minot, and the local media was kind of running about this crime wave that had hit Minot over the years, and it was like carjackings are up, and I'm like, carjackings in Minot? Like, what is going on? Well, it turned out there was, and I'm not saying it's okay or it was a good thing, but there was a bunch of teenagers who were breaking into cars and taking them for joyrides. Not great. It kind of sucked. But because they did it like 5 or 6 times, there was like a 400% increase in carjackings in Minot, right? Because it almost never happened before. And then we had a spate of one small group of people doing them, and we saw an increase, and then it created this perception, oh, things are going to hell in Minot. Well, not really. So I do think that context is really important. Let's talk a little bit about a situation that came up in the Cascade. I was part of reporting it. My colleague April Baumgarten at the Forum obviously did a lot of excellent work on this. And it was related to a relationship between someone in your office, a prosecutor, Sherilyn Turnus, and a detective for the Fargo Police Department. Now, you said earlier, obviously, your office doesn't employ investigators. You work closely with the police department, but you're independent. And I always think that's such an important part of the criminal justice system that a lot of people don't necessarily understand, that the police are not partners with the prosecutors. The police are independent. They're there to establish the facts of a case that are going to be used by both the defense and the prosecution. So in that situation, though, it was a relationship between a prosecutor and a detective. And I want to be, first of all, I have absolutely no problem with that. They're human beings. People fall in love. That's great. I think the problem was it wasn't disclosed. And certainly that's been the complaint for defense attorneys, where they were saying, listen, this wasn't disclosed to us in a timely fashion. What are your feelings about the way your office handled that?
I think that's where communication is so important, because I think people were assuming that everybody knew, but not everybody knew. And I think that both Sherilyn and Troy are extremely ethical. I think they're both very good at what they do. But when not everybody knows about the relationship, then there might be a perception that there's a conflict of interest. I don't think that either one of them would compromise a case because of their relationship.
And to be clear, there's in everything that I've looked at, there's been no evidence that that's happened. It's just
exactly
the only sticking point has been the fact of the relationship. So I don't want to besmirch either of them. I have no reason to disbelieve you're telling me that they're completely ethical, honest people. I have no reason to dispute that at all. So I don't want to make it like I'm trying to besmirch them. Your argument is it's communication. One issue, because when I communicated with Birch Burdick about this, he had told me that they had put in place policies to make sure, but yet we still had cases going on months later after he had been made aware of the relationship, where there were defense attorneys saying, listen, the lead investigator in my murder case is dating the prosecutor. They were feeling like there should have been a disclosure. She should have been reassigned. I mean, obviously, that's problematic, isn't it?
I think that the prosecutors handling that case had done what they could to limit that appearance. And I think that the legal research would show that from a legal standpoint, our office had done nothing wrong in not disclosing that information sooner. But also what April quoted in her story this morning, as far as the ethical obligations of the prosecutor, they might differ from what legally is defensible. I think I like that the two of them are dating. I think that
Sure.
they're both really nice people, and
Yeah.
but I can also see the other side, where as a defense attorney, you're wanting to do the best that you can for your client. And if you're not aware that this information is out there and it comes to light at the last minute, then you don't know exactly how you're going to approach it or address it in front of a jury.
If you had been the state's attorney and had learned about this relationship, how would you have handled it?
That is a great question. And when this came to light, my thought has always been we should be as transparent as possible. And again, to me, I think it just goes back to communication. When I found out about it, I thought that I was the last to find out about it, or I assumed that everybody else in the office knew. And I think that's probably part of the problem, is that everybody assumed that everyone else knew, but people didn't know. So as you said before, Birch has been working on policies. A lot of us have been contributing input to that, but I think we can always be doing better, right? And we can learn from every instance how we can do better.
Your office, because it kind of it's kind of interesting. I've always thought that because, like you said, you are independent from the investigators, the law enforcement agencies, the sheriff's department, the police departments. They're separate, and they do the investigations, and then they bring a case to you, and then you decide, are we going to prosecute it? Are we not going to prosecute it? What charges are we going to bring, et cetera, et cetera. But then the laws that you're enforcing are also made by another independent, well, really two, the legislature, and then obviously the governor's office has the veto authority. What is the role of the state's attorney in terms of policy making, right? Because obviously that's the realm that I work in, right? All day long. It's that's what this whole political thing is about, is in pursuit of what policies we want in place. So what is the role of your office in saying, for instance, like criminal justice reform or drug courts or whatever? Do you see it as your job to stand up and tell the legislature, listen, we need this and not this?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I think that we do have that role. And I think part of it is because of the unique position that we're in. We are constantly having to balance the reports that we get from law enforcement with the victims and meeting their needs. Also, the legislature, the law. If statutes aren't working, I think we have an obligation to figure out why they're not working and see if we can help fix them. Also, when our cases get appealed, then we have to look at what those opinions from the Supreme Court mean. And if we had a role in creating either the statute or the case law, going back, reviewing that and seeing how we can make things better, because ultimately everybody has the same goal. We want a safe community. We want people to feel safe and secure in their homes. We want people to stay here and raise their families. But also we have to think about resources. And as prosecutors, we have wide discretion on what we charge, what we recommend for sentences, how we move our cases through the system, how we might resolve them. And I think we have to be very mindful of that, because I do think that we are in a very powerful position. But because of that position, I think we're also able to create a lot of change.
I think I liked about the powerful position. I mean, you wield probably the most awesome power government has, right? The ability to deny people their liberty. Obviously, you can't just unilaterally, it's through the court and a jury or a judge weighs in or whatever. But I mean, really, that's what your office is doing. You are working often to deny people liberty. For excellent reasons. I put it that way. It sounds terrible. But obviously, I mean, these are people, we're doing it in response to somebody who is allegedly committed a crime. So I guess what I'm trying to say is hugely important. Awesome power. It's where the rubber meets the road, really. So let me ask you this last question. Why you and not Mr. Youngren? Why should Cass County's voters say we want you to be the new prosecutor and not Mr. Youngren?
Well, first I want to go back to yes, we do have awesome power, but the court, the judges really are making those ultimate decisions.
Checks and balances, right?
But I also think that we can't hide behind their decisions either. And if they're not giving us the bail, for example, if they're not giving us the bail requests that we're making, where are we being deficient in our arguments for that? Because we want to be making sure that those people who are not safe in our community are being held. We want to make sure that those are the people that we're concentrating our resources on. If we're not getting the sentences that we want, again, we have so much data that we haven't tapped into that if we did, I think that we could make better, stronger arguments to the judges, and I think we could get better sentences. But on the flip side, I think we also have an obligation to treat each case uniquely, because all the situations are different. Every case, the facts are different. And I think my view of what the role is, I would like us to be more effective inside the courtroom, but also outside the courtroom. I think that's one of the areas why I think people should vote for me, is because my vision for the office is not centered around the courtroom. It's so much broader than that. It's how can we utilize our position to strengthen our partnerships, not only with law enforcement, but also with public health and the parole and probation and homeless services, even the DOT, to help people to not even get into the system, or if they do, to get them out as quickly as possible. And then on the end, supporting things that help with a successful reentry into the community. I think that's why Adam and F5, they're doing such good work.
Adam Martin.
Helping people.
The F5
yeah,
project.
Adam Martin.
Yeah. I agree with you. I would get really frustrated. Like DUI policy is one example. And it was like we were measuring the success of DUI policy by the number of people we were arresting for DUI. And I get it. Enforcement's part of the equation. We want to catch people who are breaking the law. But I always thought, like, what if we just want to get people home safe, right? I mean, what if the point is public safety? The point is not incarceration. And I think sometimes we just take it for a given. Well, there's criminals out there, and the only thing we do with criminals is we throw them in jail. And I mean, in the most basic way, yes, that's correct. But I mean, it seems to me like if we get to a point where we're putting people in jail, then there's probably some failures along the way that we could talk about. I mean, listen, some people are just going to have to go to jail. They make terrible decisions, they do terrible things, and they're just going to have to go to jail. That's reality. That's society. But I think there's so much more that we could do sometimes, and just the way we talk about the issue, the way we measure the problems, our priorities, the data that we're prioritizing, that matters so much more. And so I guess when I hear someone say that it's odd to hear a state's attorney say that their vision for the office is not centered around the courtroom. It's like, well, what else do you do? You're in the courtroom all day. But I think that's refreshing, because if we're in a courtroom, something's broken down. And maybe the something that's broken is not something we can do about, but often it is something we can do about, and we ought to be talking about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. When we see people back time and time again, we should be asking ourselves, what did we do wrong as well? Yes, they're making poor decisions, but if we're not trying to at least figure out how to dig down to the root of what's causing their behavior, how can we expect to change it? That's when we're sending people to the penitentiary, for example. If all they're doing is sitting in a cell, why do we expect that when they come out, they're going to all of a sudden become law-abiding?
Yeah. Well, that's, again, to your point about the DUI offender, like the 40, I had never thought about it. I guess I was aware of the phenomena, but like 48 hours, like if you keep somebody incarcerated for more than 48 hours, you may do some things to them. I mean, you may alter the trajectory of their lives, because you get past 48 hours. Well, that's when they're going to have to start explaining why they're not at work. That's where things are going to open to their family. Family may turn their backs on them. Work may fire them. Someone who, okay, I got a DUI. Now I've also lost my job because I got a DUI. I mean, you've put them on a trajectory to possibly more substance abuse, possible more crime commission. What have we done in terms of our goal of creating a safe society? What have we done? We've hurt ourselves, not helped ourselves. And that's the sort of thing we got to get away from. So anyway, Kim Hegvik, candidate for Cass County State's Attorney. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.